anything more excruciating than feeling your own body turn against you? Marcus Thompson never imagined that an ordinary taxi ride would become his worst experience. At 33, he had faced many fears in his life, but nothing compared to the terror he was about to discover within himself. The night was particularly dark when he decided to take a taxi home after another exhausting day at the office. The streets of Chicago felt different that night, as if something sinister hovered in the humid, heavy air. The driver was a silent, middle-aged man with eyes that avoided contact in the rearview mirror. Marcus settled into the back seat, feeling a strange discomfort he couldn't explain. It was as if 1,000 invisible needles were beginning to pierce his skin from beneath. Initially, he attributed the sensation to the stress of work and the long hours he'd spent hunched over documents. But as the minutes passed, the sensation intensified in a way that defied any logical explanation. Traffic was slower than usual, and Marcus began to sweat profusely. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he could feel his heart pounding against his chest. He tried to breathe deeply, but each breath seemed insufficient. The air inside the taxi was becoming suffocating, thick with a strange odor he couldn't identify. It was something wild, primal, stirring deep instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Marcus tried to talk to the driver to distract himself from his growing discomfort, but his words came out slurred and confused. The man behind the wheel only mumbled vague answers, keeping his eyes fixed on the road. It was then that Marcus noticed something disturbing. His nails were visibly growing, becoming thicker and sharper. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating from extreme fatigue. The pain that had begun as a subtle tingling now spread throughout his body, like liquid fire coursing through his veins. Marcus felt his muscles contract involuntarily, as if something inside him were trying to break through his human skin. He clenched his fists, trying to control the convulsions that were beginning to rack his body. Panic gripped him as he realized his teeth were becoming sharper, cutting his own tongue as he tried to swallow the saliva building in his mouth. The driver finally glanced in the rearview mirror, and Marcus saw a flash of recognition in the man's eyes. It wasn't surprise, but rather a grim confirmation of something he already knew. Marcus tried to scream to call for help, but his voice came out as a hoarse, inhuman growl. The transformation had begun, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His rational mind fought against the growing animal ferocity bubbling within his chest, but it was quickly losing ground to something far more primal and powerful. The fabric of his shirt began to stretch dangerously as his muscles expanded beyond normal human limits. Marcus could feel every fiber of his clothing protesting the transformation of his body. His ribs seemed to be rearranging, creating a broader, more powerful structure. The sound of bones shifting echoed inside his head like an ominous concert of irreversible changes. The reflection in the window showed a face he barely recognized as his own. Her eyes, once brown and calm, now shone with a wild intensity that frightened him deeply. It was like looking at a stranger who had invaded his own body. Marcus tried to touch her face, but his hands now ended in claws that easily tore through the backseat upholstery. The full moon appeared between the clouds at that exact moment, its silvery rays penetrating the taxi window and illuminating the transformation taking place. Marcus felt an inexplicable connection to that celestial light, as if it were calling to something deep and dormant in his soul. The driver suddenly accelerated, as if he too sensed the urgency of the moment. What would you do if you discovered your entire life had been built on a lie? Marcus Thompson was discovering that his seemingly normal existence concealed a cursed inheritance that was now manifesting itself in brutal and irreversible ways. As the taxi drove through the deserted streets, his transformation accelerated with terrifying speed. His senses were sharpening supernaturally, allowing him to perceive every sound, every odor, every vibration with a clarity he had never experienced before. The smell of the driver's fear was now unmistakable to Marcus. It was a sour, metallic aroma that mingled with the worn leather of the vehicle's interior. But there was something else, something that made his stomach contract with a hunger that went beyond the physical. It was a primal hunger he had never felt before, a need that transcended any normal human experience. His gums ached as new, sharper, more predatory teeth forced their way through his flesh. The skin on his arms began to grow dark hairs emerging from dilated pores. Marcus watched in fascinated horror as his humanity literally disappeared before his eyes. Each hair that sprouted from his skin represented another step away from everything he knew about himself. His hands, once dedicated to typing reports and signing contracts, now transformed into primitive hunting instruments. The driver muttered something unintelligible, his words blending with the roar of the engine and the sounds of the nighttime city. Marcus tried to focus on the words, but his hearing was becoming selective, automatically filtering out the sounds that mattered to his new nature. The beating of distant hearts, the movement of small animals in the alleys, the whispers of the wind through the buildings, all of these were now part of his expanded sensory world. His clothes began to tear more severely as his body assumed proportions that defied the limits of the fabric. The shirt he had carefully chosen that morning now hung in orange tatters from his expanding torso. Marcus felt a mixture of shame and liberation as he watched his civilized appearance literally shredded. It was as if years of social conformity were being ripped away along with his clothes. The taxi swerved sharply, and Marcus was thrown against the door. The impact should have been painful, but his transformed body absorbed the shock with a resilience that surprised him. His bones were becoming denser, his muscles more resilient. It was as if he were becoming an enhanced, more dangerous version of himself, but the price of this evolution was his very humanity. The car window now reflected a creature that retained only vague traces of Marcus Thompson. His human eyes still shone with pain and confusion, but around them, his face was elongating into a partial snout. His nostrils flared, capturing scents that told complex stories about every person who had passed through these streets in the last few hours. The world was becoming an open book of smells and sounds that he could read with disturbing ease. Marcus tried to grab the door handle, hoping to escape this impossible situation, but his new claws would only scratch the metal without being able to operate it properly. He was trapped, not only physically in the vehicle, but biologically in a transformation that seemed to have its own inexorable will. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to completely lose control over your own mind? Marcus was discovering that the physical transformation was only the beginning of a much more terrifying process. As his anatomy altered, his psyche also underwent profound and frightening changes. Thoughts he had never before had begun to invade his consciousness like fragments of an alien personality awakening inside his head. The rational part of his mind screamed desperately for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was an especially vivid dream, or perhaps he was suffering a complete nervous breakdown. But the physical reality of his claws ripping through the upholstery of the bench, the growing weight of his transformed muscles, and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth made it impossible to deny what was happening. Marcus Thompson, respectable accountant and exemplary citizen, was becoming something that defied all human logic. The driver turned on the radio, and the sound of electronic music mingled with Marcus's racing heartbeat. But his transformed ears captured much more than the superficial melody. He could hear the nuances of each instrument, each layer of sound, as if his hearing had become a high-precision device. Even more disturbing, He began to hear the sounds of the city with uncanny clarity, distant conversations, the movement of rats in the sewers, the flight of night birds. His hands, now a grotesque mix of human limbs and predatory paws, trembled uncontrollably. Marcus watched with morbid fascination as dark hairs continued to sprout from his skin, gradually covering his arms and chest. Each strand seemed to have a life of its own, emerging from dilated pores he had never noticed before. The process was not just uncomfortable, it was a completely new sensory experience, mixing pain, itching, and a strange sense of completeness. The transformation of his face was accelerating at an alarming rate. Marcus could feel his facial bones rearranging with small, audible pops. His nose was lengthening and flattening, his nostrils expanding to accommodate a much more sophisticated olfactory system. The distorted reflection in the window showed a creature that still retained its human eyes, but the rest of his face was molding into something more jungle-like than civilization-like. The appetite that had begun as a vague sensation had now become a ravenous hunger that dominated his thoughts. It wasn't a hunger for ordinary food, but for something far more primal and disturbing. Marcus tried to suppress these urges, fighting instincts that seemed encoded in his DNA. His saliva had thickened, and he could taste the iron that indicated fundamental changes in his body chemistry. The taxi passed a group of people walking on the sidewalk, and Marcus felt an instinctive reaction that terrified him. His muscles contracted in preparation for a hunt his civilized mind completely rejected. It was as if two different consciousnesses were fighting for control of his body. One human and terrified, the other savage and hungry. The internal battle was becoming as intense as the physical transformation. His nails had completely transformed into sharp, curved claws, perfect for tearing and holding prey. Marcus watched them with a mixture of horror and involuntary admiration. They were natural weapons of lethal efficiency, and part of his transformed mind felt proud of this evolution. This duality of feelings was becoming the most disturbing part of the entire experience. What happens when you realize you've never truly known yourself? Marcus was facing the terrifying realization that his transformation wasn't just physical, but revealed hidden aspects of his own nature that had lain dormant throughout his adult life. As the taxi continued its journey through the nighttime city, he began to experience flashes of memories that weren't his own, or perhaps were ancestral memories encoded in his blood. Visions of dark forests and nocturnal hunts invaded his mind like fragments from an old film. Marcus saw through eyes that weren't quite human, stalking prey through wild landscapes beneath the glow of a full moon. These memories weren't his own, yet they felt more real and vivid than many of his own life experiences. It was as if an entire lineage of transformed ancestors were awakening in his consciousness. The driver glanced again in the rearview mirror, and this time Marcus could see something like pity in the man's eyes. There was knowledge there, a familiarity with the process Marcus was experiencing. The taxi driver wasn't surprised or terrified by his passenger's transformation. On the contrary, he seemed to be following a specific route, as if he knew exactly where to take a metamorphosing creature. The physical pain was intensifying as his bones continued to rearrange themselves. Marcus could feel his spine lengthening, preparing for a posture unlike that of a human. His ribs expanded to accommodate larger lungs, and his heart pounded with a force that felt like it could shatter his own ribs. The transformation process wasn't just a change, but a complete reconstruction of his basic anatomy. His clothes were now nothing but rags hanging from his transformed body. The orange shirt he'd chosen that morning was completely ruined, ripped by the changes to his muscular torso. Marcus felt a strange nostalgia for his former appearance, for his normal, predictable life that now seemed to belong to someone else. Each torn piece of fabric represented another broken link to his humanity. The city's smell was becoming unbearably intense. Marcus could distinguish thousands of different odors: car exhaust, decaying food, mixed perfumes, human sweat. Even people's emotions seemed to have distinct scents. His transformed mind automatically catalogued each scent, creating a complex olfactory map of the world around him. It was simultaneously fascinating and unsettling to have access to so much sensory information. The full moon appeared again between the clouds, and Marcus felt a deep, inexplicable connection with its silvery light. It was as if the celestial body was speaking directly to something primal in his soul. His muscles twitched involuntarily as the moonbeams touched his transformed skin through the taxi window. The moonlight wasn't just illumination, it was fuel for his metamorphosis. Marcus tried to speak again, but what emerged from his throat was a sound somewhere between a human groan and an animal growl. His vocal cords were changing, adapting to produce sounds he had never imagined he could make. Verbal communication was becoming secondary as other, more primitive methods of expression took precedence in his mind. The taxi turned onto a darker street, away from the main city lights. Marcus realized the driver was deliberately heading toward less populated areas. There was a methodology to the route that wasn't random. The man behind the wheel knew exactly what his passenger was becoming and had experience dealing with similar situations. Can you imagine the exact moment you lose your last connection to humanity? Marcus was experiencing this terrifying transition as the last vestiges of his human identity were consumed by the relentless transformation. His reflection in the window now showed a creature with only its human eyes as a reminder of the man it had once been. The rest of its face had partially elongated into a snout with fangs emerging from bleeding gums. The transformation had reached a point where physical pain gave way to a strange sense of power. Marcus felt stronger and more agile than he had ever been in his life. His senses were so heightened that he could perceive the driver's racing heartbeat, the scent of adrenaline in the confined air of the vehicle, and even the subtle vibrations of the engine through his modified bones. It was a completely new sensory experience that challenged everything he thought he knew about perception. The taxi arrived at an abandoned industrial area on the outskirts of town, where empty warehouses stood like concrete skeletons against the night sky. The driver finally stopped the vehicle and turned to look directly at Marcus. There was no fear in his eyes, only the weary resignation of someone who had witnessed this transformation many times before. He spoke for the first time all trip, his voice laden with a dark wisdom about the true nature of what Marcus was becoming. Marcus tried to process the driver's words, but his mind was torn between residual human understanding and the animal instincts that now dominated his thoughts. The explanation he received was both revealing and terrifying. He was not the first, nor would he be the last, to undergo this transformation. There were others like him, a secret community of people who shared this ancient curse that remained hidden from normal society. His transformed hands gripped the door handle, and this time his claws managed to manipulate the mechanism with surprising dexterity. Marcus staggered out of the taxi, his muscles still adjusting to his new body proportions. The night air hit his transformed skin like a cold caress, and he could perceive 1,000 different scents carried on the wind. Each aroma told a story about the city's nightlife he had never suspected existed. The driver remained in the vehicle, but continued to watch Marcus through the rearview mirror. There was something like paternal protection in his gaze, as if he were an unofficial guardian of people undergoing this terrifying transformation. Marcus instinctively understood that this man had been assigned, or had assigned himself, to help others like him during the most vulnerable moments of their metamorphosis. The full moon was now directly above him, its silvery rays bathing his partially furred skin. Marcus felt an irresistible urge to lift his transformed face to the heavenly light. It was as if the moon were calling to something deep within his new nature, awakening instincts that had lain dormant for generations. The call was so powerful that it completely overwhelmed his conscious will. His muscles contracted and relaxed in rhythmic waves, completing the final stages of his transformation. Marcus could feel his body stabilizing into his new form, a hybrid blend of human and predator that retained characteristics of both natures. He was stronger and faster than any human, yet still retained human intelligence and memories. This duality would become both his greatest strength and his deepest curse. How could you go on living, knowing you would never be fully human again? Marcus Thompson now faced the reality of his new existence as he stood in that abandoned lot, his transformation finally complete. The creature he had become was a disturbing fusion of man and predator, retaining his human consciousness but now equipped with capabilities that defied the laws of nature. His torn orange shirt hung from his muscular torso like a defeated flag from his former life. The taxi driver got out of the vehicle and approached slowly, his hands empty and open in a gesture of non-aggression. He explained that there were others like Marcus scattered throughout the city, people who had undergone the same transformation and learned to live with their new nature. There were unwritten rules, respected territories, and an invisible hierarchy that kept his species hidden from human eyes. Marcus was not alone, but he would never be truly free again. The bloodlust that had begun as a vague sensation now pulsed through his transformed body like a physical need. Marcus fought these urges, his residual humanity refusing to accept what he had become. But the hunger was relentless, encoded in every cell of his new body. It was an internal battle he would have to wage every night for the rest of his existence, balancing between his predatory nature and his moral conscience. The driver handed him new clothes, suitable for his transformed body, as if prepared for this situation. Marcus understood that this ritual had been repeated countless times before, and would continue to be repeated long after he learned to control his new form. There was an invisible support network for people like him, but it came with obligations and responsibilities he didn't yet fully understand. His transformed senses picked up distant city sounds, sirens, conversations, music, all blended into an urban symphony that was now part of his expanded world. Marcus could distinguish each individual sound, categorize them by importance, and even track specific movements across miles of distance. This sensory power was both a blessing and a curse, providing too much information to comfortably process. The moon began to hide behind thick clouds, and Marcus felt his connection to it gradually diminish. His transformation was now stabilized, but he knew that each full moon would bring new challenges and temptations. It would be a monthly cycle of internal struggle, of balancing his humanity against predatory instincts that threatened to consume his original identity completely. The driver ultimately identified himself as a guardian, someone who had dedicated his life to helping others through their early transformations. He offered guidance and support, but made it clear that the choices about how to live with this condition were entirely Marcus's. He could choose to completely resist his predatory impulses, embrace them fully, or find some dangerous middle ground between the two. Marcus looked at his transformed hands, watching the way the claws reflected the starlight. These were no longer the hands that had signed contracts and typed reports. They were instruments of a different nature, capable of both creation and destruction. The responsibility for controlling this power now fell entirely to him. The taxi slowly drove away, leaving Marcus alone with his new reality. He didn't know where to go or how to explain his prolonged absence to the people who were still part of his human life. Some questions would remain unanswered. Some relationships would have to be abandoned. and some truths would have to remain hidden forever. Marcus Thompson had died that night, but something new and dangerous had been born in his place.